Hi, welcome to Parks Alive. Parks Alive was originally planned as a series of environmental events to be held in the 5 smaller parks in Merthyr Tydfil. These parks are Thomastown, Troy de Roo, Aberfan, Treharris and Trelewis. Unfortunately, owing to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were unable to bring you the events as we had planned them. Instead, we're going to share with you a series of short videos demonstrating some of the skills that we were going to help share with you in this program. This particular one is called Snips and Dips, and it's the idea of taking cuttings at the end of the summer so you can have plants for your garden next year, and also at the same time save a bit of money and learn something new. And here is how we do it. This is what we will need: a sharp knife, some secateurs, some rooting compound, some peat-free compost, and some sharp sand or grit mixed at a ratio of 2 parts of compost to 1 part of grit. Some well-washed plastic pots to avoid any disease transmission. An old tile for cutting on. A dibber for making holes. A clear plastic bag or a clear bread bag that can be tied at the top. And of course, a pencil and labels for marking what we've taken cuttings of. And we need to make sure that these are dated when the cuttings go in. They can be made out of margarine tub lids, cut out quite easily. And now we need the cutting material, so we'll go and have a look at some plants that we can use for cuttings. Here is an example of the kind of plants we might wish to propagate. This plant is a prostrate rosemary, but any kind of rosemary would do. Now we need to take cuttings which are at least 4 to 6 inches long, so approximately this sort of length, or 150 millimeters if we're talking in metric. And we just take a cut. Doesn't matter where we take the cut exactly at this stage, we can just take a cutting of the plant between one of the little shoots that are on it, and that will be the cutting material we will use for the rosemary. Rosemary being a great plant for culinary uses, but also great flowers in the spring and brilliant for bees. This is a lovely plant that's used in summer bedding and in pots. It's called Osteospermum, or sometimes it's known as crazy daisy. It's actually from South Africa and it's a perennial plant, but it wouldn't necessarily survive the winter in Britain. So what we do is we take cuttings of this plant towards the end of the summer and we overwinter the small cuttings, and we'll have good sized plants in the spring for planting out. It also opens in the sun, this plant, which makes it sometimes an interesting plant to watch the flowers open as the day goes on. And when we take cuttings of this plant, we look for shoots which have not got a flower bud in them. It doesn't matter if they have got a flower bud in them, because we can always just nip that out with our fingers, pinch it out. But we want a piece which is roughly about, again, probably 4 inches, 3 to 4 inches long. Not too woody, a little bit soft, because that will make it root more easily. And we'll just take a piece of that off, and we can trim it down later when we put the cuttings in the compost. So a piece like this would do fine. This plant is a geranium or pelargonium, which has got scented leaves, and it's a great plant for the summer, but again it won't survive the winter, so it's good to take cuttings at this time of year. And all we need to do is just take a piece off which is about 4 inches long or 5 inches long. This one is a bit shorter, but it will still root, and we'll be taking the old flower off and the leaves off the lower parts of it. This would be easy to overwinter in a cool greenhouse or on a windowsill in the winter. So first of all we're going to do the cuttings of the rosemary. Now for this we need to mix the grit and the compost together. This has already been mixed, so it's nice and friable and open, and we'll fill a clean pot with some of the compost. The cuttings can be prepared like this. Choose a point on the cutting which is soft but not too soft, but quite firm in places. Take the knife and choose a point just beneath where the leaves join the stem of the plant and make a cut across. Strip off the leaves just below to about 50 millimeters perhaps. Take the rooting powder and dip the end of the cutting, just the very tip of the cutting, in the rooting powder. Make a hole in the compost and drop the cutting in and firm that down. The cuttings need a quite enclosed environment to root, so they will need moisture as well, but not too much moisture because that might encourage them to rot. Now we want to label the cuttings so we know what they are and when they were taken. Pop that in the side of the pot and give these a bit of a drink for an hour or so in a pot with a container with some water in it. And then when you take them out of there, leave them to drain for quite a while afterwards, so no excess water is in that pot. When they're drained and they've had a good drink, you need to give them an enclosed environment. There's two ways of doing this. You can either put a bag over the top of the cuttings. In the case of rosemary, this is quite a good one to do because they don't need to be too wet, and you can put an elastic band around that bag to hold it in place. Put a little saucer underneath and leave them on a windowsill, but not in full sun, somewhere which gets a bit of sun and a little bit of shade, and they will root in about 6 to 8 weeks. As they root, gradually acclimatise them to the open air by loosening the rubber band around the bottom, and eventually take the bag off and allow them to grow normally. Rosemary can cope with quite a lot of sunshine and quite a lot of dryness, so the thing with rosemary is to not let the cuttings get too wet. So a well-drained compost is really important, and it's important to let the moisture drain away after you've given them a good drink. Now we'll go on and do some different cuttings. This time we're going to do some cuttings of some geraniums. It's the same process. Just fill the pot with some grit and compost mixed together. Prepare the cuttings like this. These are a bit longer than the rosemary cuttings, and they're quite leafy as well. Now if they've got a lot of leaf on them, that's where the cutting will lose a lot of moisture, so it's important to remove some of these leaves. We can take off the old flower, we don't need that. But this is the joint where the leaf comes into the main stem. We make a cut just below the joints, like that, and we make another cut to remove the excess leaves. We end up with a cutting that looks something like that. The same principle applies as with the rosemary. Use some rooting powder. Dip just the base of the cutting in the rooting powder, no more than that. Make a hole with a dibber and drop the cutting in. Geraniums are a bit like rosemary. They come from a climate where the air is quite dry, so too much moisture around the leaves will cause them to rot and I'd even go so far as to say these could possibly root without any plastic bag over the top of them. But initially it's worth keeping the enclosed environment with a plastic bag over the top. So those will have a good drink like the rosemary, but again leave them to drain afterwards. So I'll pop those in there for a drink. And now we're going to do some cuttings of the osteospermum or crazy daisy. These cuttings root quite quickly and quite easily, so they're a good bet if you're unsure about what to root. Pot needs filling with compost like the other two. Now with these cuttings, you can see they're quite a good size, quite healthy. This is the lowest leaf. We're going to make a cut just below that. Take off that leaf, take off the next leaf and the leaf after that. Now I've got a cutting with quite a clear stem, and I'll do 2 more of those. Again, it's useful to label these as to when you took them, because then you've got a better idea about when they'll be ready to take out of the pots, or check and see if they have any roots. Don't be alarmed if you lose a few of the lower leaves during the process of the cuttings rooting, because that's just natural. As long as the main stem is green and is looking reasonably healthy, they should be okay. Similar process, put the plastic bag over the top, give them a little bit of a drink, and then leave them to drain, and pop a tray underneath them as well. This is an example of the rosemary that was taken this time last year, and as you can see, it's made a plant that's nearly 12 inches to or more high, and really that's ready to plant out or put into a larger pot. But it just shows you how easy it is to take cuttings and what you can achieve at the end of it.